Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are at the last installment of our week 1. So in this lecture we'll be talking first about the wool, and that is like one of the fibers that we have discussed or addressed in the as part of this week's lecture, and then we'll get into the details of the visual exploration and why art theory and this kind of studies can go hand in hand, what is the importance of it. So let's look at the characteristics of wool first, and then we'll move on to the next segment of this lecture. So wool is something that we find that it's another fiber, that is another protein based fiber that is extracted from animals. And in this case what we find that wool is usually we find it very soft, very supple, and then it also has a natural crimp in it. So how we find that the fibers are not really always uniform, but it kind of for the crimp it's sort of also we find that the fibers, they sort of cling with each other together, and that sort of gives it a stability, or it also adds to its strength. So that is one of the characteristics we find that to be present in wool fiber, which was perhaps not the same way possible in cotton or in silk. Now what all we also find that how for this kind of characteristics we find that the wool fiber is usually much more resilient, and that's the reason we find that it is not really very prone to wrinkles, and it's sort of even after washing or getting drenched in rain and so on, it sort of comes back to its initial form after it is dried. So it has this kind of resistance power that is inbuilt in its fibers. So this is one of the thing we find, but we also find that wool has insulating properties in it, and that's the reason it is also useful for keeping the body temperature sort of in a stable condition. And that is one of the reasons we find that when there are chances of temperature fluctuations, if the temperature drops or the temperature suddenly rises, so for those times we find that wool is something that is preferred for protecting ourselves. So wool is also something we find that that is made from various from the fibers, the body hair from various different animals, that can be goat, can be sheep, can be alpaca and so on. Alpaca is not something that is found in the Indian subcontinent. However, we can see that how goat, sheep, and then there are varieties, and then of course rabbits and so on, all of them, their hair, if the body hair is used for making wool. So in the left side of the screen we have an image of the Pashmina goat, and that is found in the Kashmir region in the Himalayan and Karakoram ranges. And there we find that how these Pashmina goats are then sort of allowed to grow their body hair, and during one season of the year we find that how these body hairs are then extracted, and this is actually in the process of extracting the body hair by sort of combing it, and that is how most of these fibers, they are sort of taken out and then made into yarn, and then of course then woven into this very expensive pashmina shawls. Now the story does not end there. Even during the extraction of the fiber, what we find that there are different kinds of fiber. The way if we think about the cocoon of the silkworms, in which we have the outer layer of the cocoon which would go for the raw silk, and then the inner layer would produce much more finer silk. So similarly we also find that there are different kinds of fiber which are there in the body of the Pashmina goat, and only the most supple, the soft, the softest of the fibers, those are then sort of sorted from the other fibers, and then they are used for making the yarn for Pashmina. So usually the body hair that we find in the neck around this area is highly that is receptive for being made into this Pashmina yarn. So these are some of the characteristics. We also can see that how even for fiber extraction there are many different factors that need to be taken care of, or that need to be considerate about when we go through one of these processes, and that is how like the end product becomes super fine, or else like it cannot have that kind of quality. So the stress on the material, the stress on this extracting technique, and then the spinning technique, cleaning technique, and all these different things are very much required for us to have a holistic understanding of how wool is made into fabric and textile. So, and of course in the right side of the image we have like the wool fiber, which is before made into the wool yarn. And this one we also see like the natural crimp is something that is sort of like exemplified here in this image as well, that makes us understand that some of the characteristics we have already spoken about, that how one fiber kind of like cling with the other much more sort of like as its inherent quality, and that is how it kind of like gives strength to the woolen fiber. Also at the same time like how it becomes resilient to wrinkling. All those things we can sort of like start connecting to this image that we have on screen here. So when we talk about wool, we talk about a lot of different things, and then perhaps like one of the issues would be there in terms of that what are the regions in which wool is extracted and then made use of. And we find definitely in the Himalayan regions we have like wool from the sheep and goat, but also at the same time we have regions in Rajasthan, in Gujarat, in Kutch, and then also in part of the Deccan we have a lot of places where herds would be making use of the sheep wool for making different kinds of like woolen fabrics. So one of just like cotton, we also have different kinds of woolen fabric that we find it there. Something would be used by communities by like for day-to-day activities, but then like some of the other things which will find that to be much more reserved for the royals, or like for very specific kind of uses. So on the left side of the screen we have this gongri, or like Nalla Gore gongri blanket that is found in Telangana, and that is made from sheep wool. And Nalla Gore, that means that this black sheep. And so the color that we see on this fabric, like this gongri or this blanket, the black is not really dyed black, but this is just the natural wool fiber that is extracted from this black goats. And so this is something that we find that is very simple kind of blanket, which are then like woven in the villages of Telangana. And then like this kind of blankets we will find that to be usually on the shoulders of the shepherds, that if the shepherds they go out in the field, and then like for the entire day they will have this blanket with them, that they can sort of like put the spread the blanket and sleep on the top of it. But also like if they get caught in rain, this blanket can also be used for protecting them in this kind of conditions. So like a blanket can be used in different kind of purposes, and my stress on this particular the shepherd community and then like their use of this gongari is to sort of remind us that not all woolen fabric are just made for not for the places which we usually associate with like mountains and like the winter climate, but it can also be used in much more harsher summer climates as well, and they're equally useful. The other thing we also need to understand that how this kind of fabric something that is this kind of wool, since these are extracted locally, and then like of course there is no other dyeing or any other thing is involved in making this kind of fabric, and that's the reason this can be used by people in the community setup. It is not expensive. It can be sort of like used, and it is not just used, but it is also incorporated in many different facets of the community life, that we find that there are certain kind of gongri which we find that to be given to a family after their childbirth, and then there are also certain kind of gongri which would be like associated with different kind of important occasions in life. So those different things we will find that to be integrally connected to this particular blanket. So these things are also reminders for us to see that how the local production, and then like this locally available knowledge, and then like this means of making, all of them, they get connected to like this community livelihood and so on. So this is something that we find, that how wool or any kind of fiber is not something that is just there for very specialized kind of textile making, but they're very much like, even if they're made into very simple kind of cloth, they still hold a lot of significance in the community, lives. And if we go with the iconographic analysis of this kind of textiles, that we see that the simplicity that is there, the coarse nature of this kind of blanket, and we might not find too much of like visual information in it. However, when we sort of like set it against the background of the community life, how like what kind of material that is sourced for making this kind of blanket, and then like how it is produced, how it is used and all, then we can understand that why this kind of blanket might hold much significance for the people in Telangana, also in part of Maharashtra and so on. Now, if this is one of the ways in which we spoke about wool and then like the locally produced woolen textiles, then the other kind of the extreme end of it would be the very specialized means of woolen shawls. And one of the shawl that we have here, that is called the map shawl of Srinagar, and this kind of pashmina shawl, we find that to be produced quite a few, or maybe not quite a few, but several of them were produced in the 18th and 19th century. And this one comes from the collection of Victoria and Albert Museum. And in this one we find that the entire shawl is first woven, and then like woolen threads are then used for making this meticulous embroidery on the top of it. We have the Jhelum river here, we also have a view of the Dal Lake here, and then like all this crisscrossing interconnected canals and waterways that sort of connect the lake with the river, and then also like how all those things connect the other part, like the different sections of the city together. And then of course like apart from this waterways, we also have like the details of the houses, the different quarters, the architectural details and everything else, all being embroidered on the top of this shawl. So when this kind of shawls are produced, we kind of like have the confusion that whether this kind of shawls are actually meant to be worn, or like they are sort of they are part of like gift giving, in which we see that how even though they are primarily of utilitarian use, but when they are gifted then to someone, then like they are meant to be sort of displayed, or like kept for special occasions. So we see that in this case definitely that this kind of a map shawl would not have much significance for the community who are perhaps like residing in the city of Srinagar or like part of Kashmir, even though like it visually shows the map of Srinagar, but the thing is that it does not really hold any kind of like the significance, the cultural significance for the people who are there in perhaps like in the same locality, but so this is one of the difference, or like perhaps in when we compare this two woolen blanket and shawl side by side, then we see that even when like some of the visual descriptions, or like the visual information is absent, still how the community can have like much significant, how it can have much significance for the communities who are making them and who are using them. And with all the visual details, the meticulous detail, then we find that it might not have much relevance for the local communities, but then it might become part of like much more complex gift giving traditions, or like how this kind of objects can be treasured by people not necessarily from the same locality, but perhaps for much more larger political alliances. So with that, we kind of like conclude this session on the materials, that what all different kinds of material that we have looked at. So we sort of looked into the geographical specificities of the Indian subcontinent, and then also like the agricultural patterns, and then like how they affect the making of different kind of these natural fibers. If we think about cotton, silk, wool, and then like starting from the technique of making this kind of fibers, if we get in the details about like what kind of significance they hold for the community, or like what all different kind of varieties are produced from these fibers, that sort of gives us a hint about this incredible diversity of Indian textiles. We will get into the details of this cotton textiles, then silk, and then of course like woolen textiles and so on in the later modules, but this was to sort of like initiate the dialogue on what all we can expect from the Indian textiles, as well as like when I talk about appreciating Indian textiles and sort of like seeing it side by side with the art historical studies, then like what is the direction that I want to take with it. So with that, we will sort of like arrive at the last segment of this lecture, and that is to do with the visual exploration and art theory, and perhaps like why there is a requirement for looking into textiles and thinking in terms of like the visual exploration, art theory, and so on. So there are certain things we find that is there in the visual exploration, and perhaps one of the things we will see, that is the relationship between theory and practice. Now, theoreticians Gillian Rose and Divya Tolley, they have argued that how there are ways in which like the visual culture, or like the visual processes, they sort of like stay almost as a bridge between theory and practice. So like by focusing on the visuals and not just restricting to the visual, but understanding that how visual can bridge the theory with the practice, that can be one of the ways in which we can understand that direction for us to consider that the visuality of textiles that we will be looking into in this course, that the visual exploration, the threads of visual exploration is something, it is actually a mean of bringing theory and practice together. Now the other thing that we also can think about in terms of like getting sensorially involved with the methods of like comprehending materials and visuals. So when we get into the details of the materials, the techniques, and perhaps like thinking in terms of like textiles, because textile is something we wear on a daily basis. It is something that is very much connected to our bodies, our senses, and then this can be one of the tools for understanding that what is the role of senses in terms of understanding visual and material. All of these things are there around us, and even when we are looking into the objects online and in the museum collections and so on, if we can connect them to something that we have around us, we might have a better understanding of the visual and material culture. Now the other thing that also comes up in this discussion about the visual exploration and art theory there is a shift in the recent literature that we also find that sort of like comes from seeing and analyzing from a distance to an immersive approach. So when we look at something, so for example the kind of that will perhaps be this shawl that we have on screen, and if this shawl is something we have object for visual analysis, we might look into the all is embroidered on the top of it, of course, like the lake, the river, the different parts of the city, all the different small sections of this neighborhoods and everything, and then of course how everything is sort of framed within the borders or the edges of the shawl. Of course we see all of them, but the visual exploration should not really just stop there. We also need to pay attention to like the fringes of this shawl, that like if we have the fringes here, and it seems like there is a clear sort of like a division between the fringe here and then like how the fringes start there. So like I mean, what kind of like, I mean, technique of making might lead towards having these different fringes, or is it added on the top of it, or like, I mean, is it part of the warp and the weft? So this kind of questions actually might lead us to understand that this is not just something as a visual that we see as a map, but it sort of like, I mean, gives us think that yes, it is a visual, but then it is also embroidered on the top of this superfine shawl that was made in the 1870s perhaps. So with this, and if we then understand that this very specific mean of like extracting wool, like, I mean, the fiber extraction and everything that sort of like, I mean, takes place in it, then we have much better understanding of it's not just about what is there on the shawl, but how this shawl might have been made. And it's not just about like, I mean, seeing just the visual and then understanding that, I mean, what might have been the city of Srinagar in the late 19th century, but we might also start thinking about that, I mean, what might have been the community lives of the weavers, the embroiders, and people who are employed in making this textile. So in other words, when we sort of like, I mean, move from seeing and analyzing to a much more immersive approach to understand or comprehend this kind of objects, the textiles, then we make ourselves available to newer ideas. And by newer ideas, I also mean that, I mean, we kind of like, I mean, start looking at the lives of the makers and the makers' histories, like, I mean, the history of producer communities are something that we find that to be neglected. Their assessment of the intellectual capability is something that is not really well recognized in the scholarship on textile and craft, and of course also in the art historical scholarship as well. So if this is some of the aspects we can also sort of intervene into if we pay close attention to the materials making and technique and so on. Now the other important part that also comes up in this kind of exploration would also be about the technologies and processes. So technologies, by that what I mean is that we have, of course, that there are many different techniques of making this kind of textiles, and when we sort of like, I mean, look into them, we kind of see that, I mean, there is this technical side of making textile, and then there might also be that a much more sort of like artistic side, intellectual side of making textile. But when we sort of see that, I mean, technology or this technique are something that is not really divorced from the artistic aspect of making textile, then we start looking at the idea of art and art history in a very different way. We do not really understand that technology, or like, I mean, the hands-on making is something that is separated from how the brain functions. And then we can also see that technologies is something that is very much sort of like, I mean, it's a window into getting more information, or perhaps like, I mean, perceiving the lives of the makers in a much more sensitive way, in a much more empathetic manner. And then in this cases, if we sort of like, I mean, see that, I mean, where do the iconography and the visual analysis, they sort of like, I mean, stand? Because if we think about the relevance of course, like, I mean, relevance of the material, technique and everything else, and then like, I mean, if still iconographic analysis hold any significance or not, and the answer will still be yes, because once we start looking at what is there in the visual, then we start like, I mean, looking at it from the point of view of our already existing knowledge. And then once we start making the connection between the objects that we study, for example the textile that we have on screen, with something that we already know, that makes us understand that what can be the possible connection between them. Now with that, we also see that, I mean, the visuals can sometimes also be misleading, sometimes they can also be deceiving. Now once we have a clear idea, or like, I mean, at least a better idea about how the visual stands, and then how the material, technique and all those other aspects, they sort of like, I mean, you know, contribute to making a particular textile, then we can always compare these two processes, and perhaps we can sort of like, I mean, synthesize knowledge differently, and not by just just relying on the visual analysis. Now with those, we also see that, I mean, the visuals are something that needs to be considered as part of a process and not really something as the end result of the process. So a lot of times when we see that, I mean, there is this shawl perhaps example, I mean, for example, if we have it here, so this shawl, one can think that, I mean, years of practice and then, like, I mean, much painstaking work of the embroiderers and the weavers that made this kind of shawl possible. So we can see that whatever is there on screen as a visual is actually the end result of the process. However, if we think that, I mean, this is not the end result, but it is something that was part of the community history, and the makers of the shawl continued to make this kind of works, perhaps not in this scale, perhaps not with this much of intricacy, but like similar kind of practices that was there, and then we do not really see that, I mean, this entire analysis, I mean, the entire visual as like end of a process, but it is part of a process. Then it also gives us a different kind of approach towards understanding our lives as well as like understanding history itself. So with that, I mean, what I'd like to sort of reminds us that, I mean, visual, when we see the visuals, we should not see that the visual as outcome, but let us think about visual as part of the process, and that is how we will also be like, I mean, approaching the other material, the visual material and everything else in the later modules. Now with those issues, we also see that, I mean, there are some of the larger concerns that sort of like, I mean, come up in terms of that, how do we perceive history then? Because as I have already mentioned in the earlier lectures, that we will be looking at history, a lot of historical material in this course. So if we see that, I mean, history is something that is not there to be seen from a distance, but it is something that needs to be experienced, then we see that, I mean, this particular way of analyzing the visual material by enlivening theory and by bringing it closer to practice, then allowing our senses to sort of take part in the analysis, also like thinking in terms of that the visual as not the end product of something, but it is part of the process. So these things can also make us enliven the history and the idea of history, which is usually relegated to the past, something that was contested in the theories of Walter Benjamin and then Hayden White and many other theoreticians. We find that, I mean, how perceiving history through this kind of experiences can lead us towards understanding our material culture, our lives and everything else around us in a new different light. And in all these different aspects, why do we think that, I mean, textile plays a very important role, is because textiles are everywhere. We wear them, we use them on a daily basis, but a lot of times we do not really incorporate them as part of art historical studies. Thank you.